Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Connecting the Continents. And in this video, we're going to talk about how to connect two Active Directory networks for fun and profit, as well as using Trust and DNS. Not to mention the fact we're also going to talk a little bit about federation services. So in this video, we're going to be looking at, first of all, the fact that Tokyo is now a Server 2008 network. So now what? And what do we do next? And then we're going to talk about the two options that we're going to start with to connect Tokyo and New York. And just so you know, there's actually more than two options, just that this is a good starting place. Then we're going to talk about the first option, Active Directory Federation Services, and what it might require to do that. Then we're going to talk about what you need for a trust between the two networks. And then we're going to talk about the Globomantics Verde Petra solution to connect New York and Tokyo. We are going to end up using trust because we're going to find out that this is actually the most cost-effective solution with the situation that we have. All right, so let's go ahead and let's get started. It's time to connect these two guys together. We have Tokyo up to date in terms of the operating system and the domain function level. Now it's time to make sure that Verde Petra, we can actually share information between the two locations. So the nice thing is that Hank did pony up for some nifty virtual private network stuff, and that's going to allow us to connect New York and Tokyo in pretty much more or less a direct connection. Now, eventually, we're going to need to combine, we're going to need to take that Verde Petra domain, and we're going to be using the Active Directory migration tool probably 3 or 4 months down the road to migrate all of the users and all the information from the Verde Petra network, and we're going to combine it into a Globomantics network, where we'd probably end up creating a child domain. But, I mean, that might take a little more time, and migration can be tricky. So the thing of it is, right now, we need to get these two offices connected together ASAP so our email servers aren't just getting walloped with attachments. So really, that's our main goal. We need to get these two offices connected now that Verde Petra really is part of the Globomantics organization. So in terms of options to connect, again, there's more than two, but these are a good start. We need to have a direct connection or a direct relationship between Globomantics and Verde Petra. We also need to have a connection between Verde Petra and the NA.Globomantics, but we're going to talk about how we can use something called a transitive trust after a little bit that will actually allow us to do that. Basically what we need is we need to have these guys all talking together. They all need to be part of the same network. Now there's two ways that we're going to start off by talking about. First of all, there's not really, I know I have this labeled as new down here. It's not really that new. Federation Services has been around since Server 2003. But basically what it does is it allows two Active Directory networks to authenticate users from either domain for shared folders and resources. Now it does use basically a web interface, okay? And it uses port 443. You should know that that's the SSL port, right? For secure transmissions back and forth. Now, most of the time, Federation Services actually does allow you to share stuff over, like I said, a web interface. So you're probably going to need a SharePoint solution or some other Active Directory Federation Services aware application in order to make that work. Now, we can also create what we call a trust between the two forests, since we really have more or less a direct link via VPN between New York and Tokyo. All right, so this connection that we have between, like the network connection itself, is pretty direct. Now, Active Directory Federation Services is really good when you need to connect two organizations that do not have a direct connection. But since we do have that VR VPN technology that Hank bought for us, well, then we're in pretty good shape to do something like that. But the question, is do we use Active Directory Federation or do we set up some kind of trust relationships? Now, you already know what the answer is, I know, because of what we covered. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about Active Directory anyway, or Active Directory Federation Services, because I think it's an important set of information for you to understand and to know in case you find yourself in a situation that is either already using it or maybe needs to implement this kind of thing. Now, Active Directory Federation Services is what we call an SSO methodology, okay? Single sign-on. Basically, a user doesn't have to sign on more than once. When they log into their machine, they'll be able to access the stuff from the other domain using Federation Services. The experience for the user is pretty seamless. Now, usually Federation Services, we use this through a website. More so, it's probably more geared towards using SharePoint services or SharePoint Server, which is also a Microsoft product. And it does use port 443, which is the SSL port, and HTTPS to transfer information back and forth. And it uses cookies to keep track of authentication in your browser. Now, let's talk about what Active Directory Federation Services requires now, okay? Well, first of all, we need, of course, 2 Active Directory Domain Services servers on both networks. Okay? Now, we're going to be connecting via the internet. Okay? So we don't need a direct connection. Now, we also need a separate Active Directory Federation Services server on each side. Now, can you have the Federation services running on your domain controllers? Well, I suppose you could. May not necessarily be the best idea, though. Now, usually, again, we're going to be using a web server, probably a SharePoint, with an SSL certificate. Now, since we're going to be connecting over the internet, we're going to need to have also a DMZ, demilitarized zone, with a Federation proxy server in that DMZ. Your web server may or may not be in the DMZ. It may be behind the firewall. Okay? But as you see, if you're going to do Active Directory Federation services right, now there are ways to do it, kind of haphazardly without all of these boxes, but it may not necessarily be the best thing. Okay, let's just say that it's probably going to be a little less secure. So in order to do Active Directory Federation services right, it's going to require probably some significant investment in time in terms of maybe doing some additions to your network. So understanding that we need all of this stuff for Federation services, let's talk about trusts, because at this point in time, Hank is just, he's been on a spending spree, and we just don't have that many dollars worth. So for smaller environments, we're much better off using a trust, which again, of course, only requires Active Directory domain controllers running. Now, it does require more or less a direct connection. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. There's ways to do that, and there's all kinds of other networking technologies to make that happen. VPN is just one. But DNS must be configured correctly on both machines, okay? So that way, when we're trying to communicate information between the 2 networks, each network knows about the other network, okay? So basically, we're going to add in, with a trust, another network to our forest. Now, for our situation, trusts really are kind of the best solution for us because we do have a secure connection between the 2 networks. We have DCs on either side of the network, even though Verde Petra only has 1 domain controller. But you notice here that how many extra boxes do we need? I see 2. That's right. You can use your existing hardware for this kind of thing, assuming that you have more or less a direct connection. Now, just so you know, each domain needs to be running at least Server 2003 functional level. And the forest functional level, we haven't talked a lot about forest functional levels at this point. All we really talked about is domain functional levels. But there's also a forest functional level that we need to concern ourselves with, and that also needs to be at least Server 2003. Now, obviously, if you're in a Server 2008 environment, a Server 2008 functional level is much preferred, right? Now, in our case, we have 2 networks that only have Server 2008 domain controllers. So setting up Verde Petra to be a Server 2008 forest functional level is kind of a no-brainer. All right, so let's talk a little more about trusts. We've discovered that at this stage in the game, trusts are probably going to be the best go because it doesn't require a lot of extra effort on our part. We don't need to know about SharePoint. We don't need to know a lot about this other stuff. We don't need to have demilitarized zones. But let's talk about the kinds of trust, because this is important information. When you start off thinking about trust, what kind of trust are you going to create? Now, there's an external trust. Okay, now, an external trust allows separate domains and separate forests to trust each other's users without trusting every domain in the forest. Let's say that we only wanted Verde Petra's users to have access to stuff in the Chicago location. Well, then we would set up a trust between Verde Petra and na.globalmantics.com. Now, Verde Petra would have no access then to the New York location. That is one possible solution. Now, that's not what we want to do, but that's just an example. A forest trust, basically, this allows trust between 2 forest root domains. And this allows users from any domain inside of either forest to share resources. Now, with the kind of situation that we're looking at, since we are assimilating Verde Petra into Globalmantics, this is probably going to be the best go because we want to have free and full potential and ability to actually allow access between the two networks no matter what domain that they're in. Now, there's another kind of trust called a shortcut trust. Now, a shortcut trust allows users to access resources in a different domain in the same forest faster. Now, this one doesn't really come into play in our situation, okay, because Verde Petra is in a completely different forest. So shortcut trusts really only work inside of the same forest, all right? Now, a realm trust allows basically a Windows Active Directory network to connect to a Unix-based network. Now, the Unix-based network also needs to use an authentication method called Kerberos in order to share resources. Now, here's what I want you to remember, okay? For the exam or even for the real world, anytime that you need to have a Windows network talk to a Unix-based network and have trust between the two, you need to think realm trust, okay? That's what I want you to remember about that. All right, now we need to talk about trust directions. Now, trust can be one-way, they can be two-way, and they can be transitive or non-transitive. Now, let's talk about a one-way trust first. A one-way trust, let's say the network A trusts network B, all right? Hence the blue line right here. Now then, what this means is if that network A trusts network B, users from network B can access allowed resources on network A, but users from network A cannot access stuff on network B. So here's the thing that I want you to kind of remember about this. Okay? When you're setting up one-way trusts, you need to essentially create the trust in the opposite way that you want the users to access stuff from. Okay? Because network A trusts network B, and again, users from network B can access stuff on network A. All right? But the opposite is not true. If we want the opposite to be true, we can do one of two things. We can either switch the direction of the trust, or we can create a two-way trust. If network A trusts network B and vice versa, in a two-way trust, users from either network can access allowed resources on the other. Now, when I'm talking about users from either network can access allowed resources, really what I'm talking about is permissions, okay? I'm talking about share level permissions and all that stuff that we've talked about earlier in this video series. Now, when you have trusts, I want you to remember this, okay? When you have a two-way trust or one-way trust or whatever it is, when you're giving access to users to shared folders, because really that's the point of having a trust, okay? Is to provide access to shared resources. Remember that whole AGU DLP thing I was talking to you about earlier? Yeah, that's going to come into play again, okay? So I want you to kind of keep that in the back of your head this whole time that we are looking at this. And by the way, I'm going to give you a short demonstration of AGU DLP in the demonstration sections. It's kind of a limited demonstration, but you'll get the point. And you already know about AGU DLP and how to implement it fully. So I'll just give you a short review when we get into the demo. All right, so let's talk about transitive trusts too. Now, trust can be transitive or non-transitive. Now, here's the way a transitive trust works. If domain A trusts domain B and the trust is transitive, okay, let's put a T here for transitive, and if B trusts C, and this is a transitive trust, then A and C also have a trust relationship, okay? So because A trusts B and B trusts C, then C trusts A. All right? That's what a transitive trust means. Now, you don't have to have a transitive trust, okay? Especially if the environment that you're working in, you're not assimilating another company. Maybe you just have a partnership. That trust may not necessarily be the best way to go. And by the way, if you are just creating a partnership to allow access to shared resources between two parties that are separate organizations, separate companies altogether, that whole Active Directory Federation services might be the better go. Now, in our instance, since we're assimilating Verde Petra, let's say Verde Petra is network C, okay? Now, let's say that Globomantics is network B, and let's say that North America.Globomantics is network A. Well, since Globomantics and Verde Petra trust each other, and North America and Globomantics trust each other, as long as we set up transitive trusts, we have a trust relationship between North America, Globomantics, and Verde Petra, okay? So that's just a short bit on transitive trust. It's pretty easy to understand if this is the kind of situation that you need. Now, let's say that we're not going to have transitive trust, then the story changes, right? Then we actually might have to create a specific trust in one particular direction or another. Now, here's what we're going to do with Globomantics and Verde Petra. Now that we have an understanding of trusts and federations, we're going to be using trusts. Again, the deal is that Hank spent big dollars buying out Verde Petra. The budget right now is a little slim. Okay. Now, Federation Services is going to require a lot more hardware, not to mention the fact that you don't know anything about SharePoint because you haven't yet purchased or watched some great SharePoint training that some guy named Coach Culbertson did from Train Signal. All right, enough sales pitch. But since you don't know, we're going to pretend that that's the case. Because I don't know, maybe you have watched my SharePoint training. I don't know. But right now, we don't have a SharePoint box. All right? So it doesn't make any sense to use federated services at this stage in the game. Not to mention the fact, eventually what you want to do is you want to take the users from Verde Petra and assimilate them into Globomantics so that Verde Petra eventually as an Active Directory domain is going to go away. Now, since we don't know what we're going to do yet with the Verde Petra brand name and all that stuff, well, we're not going to assimilate them just yet. Eventually, though, we can use a tool called the Active Directory Migration Tool. By the way, it's a free download from Microsoft. Just go to Microsoft.com, type in Active Directory Migration Tool. It's pretty easy to use. And you can move all the users from Tokyo into Globomantics and all that good stuff. Eventually, we're going to be replacing the Verde Petra domain with tk.globomantics.com. But not today, okay? So the eventual plan is to take and assimilate them all together. But we don't have the time to do that at this point. And not to mention, migration is not something that you want to take lightly, something you want to take time to plan out very, very well. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating the following trust relationship strategy between Globomantics and Verde Petra in order to get moving really fast. So you're going to be implementing a two-way forest trust right down here between Verde Petra and Globomantics, all right? Now, by the way, this trust is going to be transitive, all right? So that way we can actually have a transitive trust between Verde Petra and also na.globomantics. And by the way, the trust relationship between na.globomantics and Globomantics, you didn't really realize this yet, but we've actually already created it. It was created for us automatically, and I'll show you that trust relationship setting in the demonstration. But that was created for us automatically when we created na.globomantics. Now, here's the deal. We could create an external trust. So that way users will be able to access stuff a little faster. This kind of takes the place of a shortcut trust, by the way. Now, we might do this and we might not. If we have a transitive trust, these two guys already trust each other. Not a problem. If we create this external trust, things will just be a little faster. Okay, that's really all it boils down to. So tell you what, I think what we might do for our demonstrations, we might skip this for the time being, because after you find out how to create trusts, if we find out that users between Globomantics or the Chicago office Globomantics are having a hard time getting to resources in Verde Petra over in Tokyo, or vice versa, then we might go back and create the external trust. So I think for our demonstration, we'll probably skip this one for the time being. Now, before we jump headlong into creating the trust, though, okay, you need to ensure that the DNS servers on both networks are configured to know about each other. Right? Now, we have two DNS servers that are both Active Directory integrated, which is really nice because Active Directory takes care of most of our DNS replication and all that good stuff. But when we create a trust, it does not make it so that either DNS server knows about the other one. All right? So it's really important to have your DNS servers know about each other, so that way when you start to create the trust, it's real easy for the two DNS servers to talk to each other and say, hey, I got this here, hey, I got this here. It's real easy for your two DNS servers to communicate where stuff is at and provide information to the domain controllers and all that good stuff. So it's really important that DNS servers are set up first before you start building your trusts. Now here's what you're going to do. Okay, we're going to create what we call a stub zone on each DNS server. So this way, any DNS requests for resources on the other network will be forwarded over to the DNS server in that other network. Okay? But if we don't have those stub zones, we're going to have some problems. All right? So here's how it's going to work. All right, let's say we have a Globomantic server running DNS, which we do, okay? And let's say we have the Verde Petra server running DNS, which we do. Let's say that we have a shared mapped drive over here that has a file on it called the Tokyo Sales Numbers.xls. And let's say it's actually on the Verde Petra server because, it's a small shop. It's only got 10 people in it, so they're using their domain controller as also a file server, which I know is not the best idea, but, it's a small shop. It's, with 10 people, it's probably going to be okay. But nevertheless, let's say that yellow hat guy over here, let's call him Bubba, all right? Bubba says, dude, you know what? I need the Tokyo sales numbers. So Bubba's computer puts in a request to the Globomantic server running DNS and says, hey, you know what? I need information on how to find this particular machine and this particular resource. Well, the Globomantic server says, dude, this request is for Verde Petra. Now, I have a stub zone that will tell you which DNS server to ask about. So the Globomantic server returns that DNS information back over to the computer. This computer then goes ahead and it sends a request over to the Verde Petra server running DNS and gets information about how to find the stuff over here. Now, since the DNS server and the file server and the domain controller are all on the same box, the DNS server says, yes, I have this, and then the two machines go ahead and continue to negotiate a connection between Bubba's computer and the DNS server over here. And eventually, Bubba is going to get access if he's given permissions, right? Don't forget that you always have to set up permissions, okay, when you're looking at shared folders, especially when you're going across different domains. But eventually, Bubba is going to get information and is going to get access to this Tokyo sales number Excel sheet, and he's going to be happy. But again, there's two things that need to happen here. First of all, there needs to be a trust. There needs to be permissions for Bubba to get access to this Tokyo sales numbers document. And we also need to have DNS stub zones. And by the way, there's another method I'm going to tell you about in the demonstration called a conditional forwarder. It can do a similar thing. But you can either have a stub zone or a conditional forwarder. You can't have both, just so you know. So we need trusts, permissions, and we need to have DNS set up running properly so that the two networks know about each other and how to find resources using DNS records on either side of this equation. Okay, so here's what we're going to do, all right? I'm going to take you over to the servers now, and we're first going to set up the DNS stuff. After we set up the DNS stuff correctly, then we're going to create the trusts. Now, after the trusts are created, I'm also going to give you a short demonstration of how you would actually grant access to users from a universal group over here in Verde Petra and give them access to stuff over in Globomantic. All right, so enough talk. Let's get over here and let's start getting some stuff done. All right, so here you see we're over on NYDC2. We'll start off here. Now, first what we need to do is we need to create that stub zone, okay? So this way, as we begin, NYDC2 and the Globomantic network will at least know that Verde Petra exists, all right? So we're going to start off by doing that by going into the DNS server section, into DNS, NYDC2, and then we're going to go into the forward lookup zones, okay? Now, we're going to talk more about DNS in the certification section, but here's where we're going to start off, okay? Now, when I right-click, we're going to create what we call a zone. Now, basically, a zone is you might have heard of zone files from other networking classes or books you may have read. That's more or less kind of what we're doing, except that it's really more of, rather than a file, it's really more of a set of database records, okay? So I'm going to tell it next. And now we get the different types of zones. Well, here's what we want to do. We want to create a stub zone. Now, here's what a stub zone does. It creates a copy of a zone containing only the name server, start of authority, and possibly host records. Now, this particular stub zone, basically all it does is it points you over to the other network's DNS server. That's all it really does. It tells you where it's at. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tell it next. And by the way, I'm going to tell it to store the zone in Active Directory. Now, there's a lot of advantages to storing your DNS stuff in Active Directory, but one of them is that once we create the stub zone on one of our domain controllers, it will be replicated out to the rest of your domain controllers too. So you only have to create the stub zone once. I'm going to go ahead and tell it next. I'm going to have it propagate out to all DNS servers in the whole Globomantics for us. So basically, over in na.globomantics, everybody that's in Globomantics right now will receive this information. And again, we're just telling it to where to go find the Verde Petra DNS servers at. We'll tell it Verde Petra. Now we need to put in the IP address of the Verde Petra DNS server. And in this case, it's 168.5.200. And am I kind of cheating a little bit with the IP addresses? Yes, a little bit. Okay, for demonstration purposes, I kind of have to. But you'll put in the IP address of the DNS server of the other network right here. Now we're going to use the above servers to create a local list of master servers. Basically what we're doing is we're going to query this DNS server. We're going to say, hey, Verde Petra DC, do you have any other DNS servers? And it'll respond back and populate in with any other name servers out there. Now, for a fact, I know that Verde Petra does not have any other name servers because it's a one domain controller environment. And we all know from the previous videos that that's not the best solution, right? We should have at least 2 domain controllers for redundancy in every segment of our network if we can afford it. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to tell it next, and now we're going to tell it finish. Let's go ahead and go into this particular zone for verdepetra.com, and you'll see here we have the information that we need for Verde Petra, including the start of authority, the name server, and the host record. And we're going to talk more about DNS stuff later on in another video. Right now, what I need you to understand is that in order to connect 2 networks using a trust, their DNS servers have to know how to reach each other. The easiest way to do that is with a stub zone. Now, by the way, we could also create conditional forwarders too. If you create a conditional forwarder, you can't create a stub zone and vice versa, okay? So you can either have a stub zone like what we've created, or you can have a conditional forwarder, but you can't have both. All right, so we've done the work over here for Globomantics. Now, let's bounce on over to the Tokyo server, Verde Petra, and let's also create a stub zone over there. All right, so here we are over on the Verde Petra machine. Let's go ahead and let's log in here real quick. And you'll notice that Verde Petra is still running under the name administrator. Yeah, that's not very good, is it? We've already learned that. All right, so here we are in Verde Petra, and you see that we're already in the forward lookup zone. So now I'm going to right-click and make a new zone. Again, what I need to do is I need to tell Verde Petra where the DNS server is for Globomantics. That's really what I'm doing by creating this stub zone. I am going to be storing the zone in Active Directory, although it's not that useful over at Verde Petra, though, due to the fact that Verde Petra is a single domain controller. But it's not going to hurt anything either. So let's going to go ahead and tell it yes. And now we're going to replicate the data all the way out to the entire forest, which is, of course, one domain controller. And we'll tell it next. And now we need to put in a zone name. And I'm just putting in the name of the domain, globomantics.com. That's all I need. Okay, it's nothing that extensive. I'm going to tell it next. And now I'm going to put in the IP address of the main globomantics.com DNS server. And you know, we have actually 2 to pick from at this point in time. I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to use 0.3. Okay, I'm going to press the tab key, and it goes ahead and it validates it. Now, this might take a little more time if your server is actually across the sea. Okay, now since we're using virtual machines, it's going to go pretty much instantly for us. Now, we're going to go ahead and use the above server. We're going to query this server and have the stub zone be populated with information from NYDC2 about the name servers, the DNS servers that are over in Globomantics. So this way, Verde Petra and any machines that are trying to get the stuff over in Globomantics will know where to go find or how to go find the DNS servers to find that stuff, okay? So now let's take a look here in the Globomantics stub zone that we just created. And you'll see here that it's populated automatically. I'm going to scroll over just a little bit. You see that it's populated it with all 3 of our DNS servers. Okay, so we didn't have to do anything to make all of this stuff show up. All we had to do is tell it where to start at, which was at DC2. And DC2 provided all of this information for you automatically. So you didn't have to enter in any of this stuff. Okay? All right, so now Verde Petra knows about Globomantics. It knows that Globomantics has these name servers, these DNS servers. So now let's go back on over to globomantics.com. Let's look at back to DC2. Now, I like to do a lot of the big work on the primary domain controller emulator. Remember, that's DC2, right? The PDC emulator. So we're going to go back over there, and we're going to now create the trusts between Globomantics and Verde Petra. So not only will they know about each other, but they'll also be able to communicate and allow each other's users to have access to resources on the other side. But again, before we get into the trust thing, we have to create some kind of DNS setup. And again, remember, we could do a stub zone, or we could do conditional forwarders. Now, a conditional forwarder, all it is basically it says, oh, well, hey, this is a record for, and this is a request for something that's over on the other network. I'll send that information on over there. Stub zones and conditional forwarders have very similar purposes at the end of the day. But again, we have to have at least one or the other, okay, before you do a trust. Oh, but you know what? There's one more thing before we leave Verde Petra that I want to talk to you about, okay, because this is going to cause problems, especially if you're in an upgrade situation. Now, this box was an upgraded 2003 machine. Now, remember how we were talking about functional levels and all that? Well, you know what? Let's right-click on Verde Petra and let's see where our functional level is right now for the domain. Now, for the domain, we're running at 2008, and that's pretty good. But let's take a look at the forest. Okay, now the forest is kind of the bigger picture. Let's go to the Start menu, Administrative Tools, and in order to get to the forest functional level, we have to go to Active Directory Domains and Trusts. Okay. Now, this is not an MMC that we've seen yet. Okay, this is a new one. But this is where we go to for the forest. Now, we didn't have to do this for Globomantics because, you know what? It was Server 2008 from the start. I'm going to right-click right here on Active Directory Domains and Trusts and raise forest functional level. Verde Petra, on the other hand, was upgraded from a 2003 box. Now, currently, you see, it's at the functional level is at Windows 2000. Well, that's not exactly what we want. If we try to connect a Server 2008 functional level Active Directory network with a Server 2000 functional level Active Directory network, we're going to have problems. As a matter of fact, we're not even going to have problems. It's just not going to do it. All right, so let's go ahead and let's raise the forest functional level to Server 2008 now. Now, it's a pretty big jump, I know. But fortunately, what we have running on the Verde Petra network is a very, very basic system. So we don't have to, probably are not going to have to worry too much about any cataclysmic happenings going on whenever we do raise the functional level. All right, so we're going to click on Raise, and it's going to tell us this change affects the entire forest. Okay, that's fine because the forest is only one domain controller. All right, the functional level is successfully raised. You see that it didn't take very long. Now we're going to go ahead and tell it okay, but now that we've raised the forest functional level, the trust between our Globomantics network and the Verde Petra network is now going to be possible. Previously, because we upgraded from Server 2003, the trust would not have worked, okay? So I want you to keep that in mind when it either comes to the test or when it comes to real life. If you're trying to connect two networks using trust, you should really have the same functional level, or at least a Server 2003 functional level, okay? If you can't get both networks up to Server 2008 specifications for the function level, use at least Server 2003, okay? But remember, with Server 2008, we have a lot of advantages that we wouldn't get with the Server 2003 functional level. Okay, let's go ahead and let's move back on over to DC2 and let's start creating the trust. All right, so here we are back over on NYDC2. And in order to create the trust, we have to start with the Start menu again and go to the Administrative Tools. We're going to go to the Active Directory Domains and Trusts MMC once more. Now, let's go ahead and expand this guy out, and let's go ahead and see what we do have currently. In Globomantics, we also have na.globomantics.com that we created. Let's right-click right on Globomantics. You know what? Before we do that, let's right-click on the Domains and Trusts. Let's check and see what forest functional level we're running. Okay, we're at server 2008 function level. We're A-OK for that side, right? We'll tell it OK. Just want to do a quick check. You just never know in case I forgot something. All right, I'm going to right-click right on globomantics.com here in Active Directory Domains and Trusts. I'm going to go to its properties. Now, the trust section is kind of hidden. I know, it's kind of one of those weird things, but you have to go to Active Directory Domains and Trusts, right-click on the domain, and then go to the domain properties. We go to the Trust tab, and here are the current trusts that we have. Now, right now, we're only trusting na.globomantics.com. Now, we didn't create this. I want you to know that. When we created na.globomantics.com, this trust was automatically created. There was nothing that we had to do to create it. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create the trust manually for Verde Petra. So I'm going to come down here to the New Trust button, and I'm going to tell it Next. And now I'm going to type in the name of the forest, which is Verde Petra. Now, I could put .com, or I could just leave it at Verde Petra. I'm going to go ahead and use the .com so that we get the DNS name in here. And now it's asking me to provide credentials for Verde Petra. So I have to use administrator and then put in the administrator password for Verde Petra, not Globomantics, right? These are the credentials for Verde Petra, and since they didn't change the administrator username, we're just going to go ahead and use administrator. So I'm going to tell it Next. And now we need to select the type of trust we want to create. Well, we want to create a forest trust, okay? Because Verde Petra is now part of the Globomantics network, it's part of the same organization, there's no reason to create an external trust because we don't have individual domains that we want to isolate for the trusts. We want everybody to have access to the same information. So we're going to be creating the forest trust because we're all one big happy family here at Globomantics. So I'm going to tell it Next. And again, which direction do we want for the trust? Do we want two-way, one-way incoming, or one-way outgoing? Now, the one-way incoming and outgoing, basically, you remember the slides that we just talked about, in which direction do we want the trust to happen? Well, in our case, we want a two-way trust because, again, we're all part of the same organization. So we're going to go ahead and leave it set to two-way. Now, a one-way incoming trust, if we want the Verde Petra users to be able to log into Globomantics, but not Globomantics logging into Verde Petra, we would pick this one. And then it's exactly the vice versa, okay, for the one-way outgoing. So we're going to stick with the two-way direction of trust because we want everybody to have the same set of information. Now, do we want to create the trust only create the trust on this side of our network, only for Globomantics? No, we're going to go ahead and let Server 2008 create the trust relationship on both domain controllers. Now, you can't create the trust on one side only if you need to, but that's not what we need right now. Okay, we want to create the trust on both domain controllers, or really both domains, at the same time and save us a little bit of time. I'm going to go ahead and tell it Next. Once again, it's asking me to put in some administrative credentials, even though I did this before. But that's not a problem. This just takes another couple of seconds to put in the administrative credentials for Verde Petra. I'm going to tell it Next. And now, how do we want our users to be able to authenticate? Now, since we're all in the same organization, we're going to pick forest-wide authentication. If we weren't in the same organization, or maybe if there were security issues around the work that we were doing or whatever, we could also have selective authentication where we could actually control who gets to log in on either side of the forest. Now, that's not what we want in this case, because then after we finish the wizard, we have to go in and grant individual access to each domain and server you want available to the users in the specified forest, okay? And again, it says this option is preferred if the forests belong to different organizations. Well, again, that's not the case of what we're looking at here. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to tell it Next. Now it's going to ask us for the scope of authentication users for the local forest. Well, again, we're picking forest-wide authentication. We want both sets of users, Verde Petra and Globomantics users, to have access to each other's network. Okay? And again, we have the same thing with the selective authentication. Well, that's not what we want, so we're going to pick forest-wide and move on. All right, so here is the quick rundown of what we're setting up. And so everything is looking good. Let's go ahead and tell it Next. And now it's going to make the trust changes both on Globomantics and over in Verde Petra. Now, after we have the trust intact, after it is in place, and we're going to have some verifications to that fact here in just a little bit too, then we're going to be able to actually utilize that whole AGUDLP strategy. We can actually have users from either side of our network accessing each other's folders as long as we have appropriate permissions granted to them. Alright, so here's what happened. Looks like everything worked A-OK. We have a transitive trust. That's good. That's also, by the way, going to allow Verde Petra users to have access to na.globomantics.com as well, because our trust is transitive. Now it's telling us to configure the new trust. We're going to click Next. Alright. Do we want to confirm the outgoing trust? Yes, we do. We'll tell it Next. It's going to do a little quick check. Do we want to confirm the incoming trust? Yes, we do. Click Next. The trust relationship was successfully created and confirmed. Our two networks are now talking to each other. This is a good thing. They trust each other. We can now share information between our two networks as we provide permissions to. And the permissions that I'm talking about are the same things we've been doing all throughout this course. It's basic user and group permissions and folder permissions. So we have successfully created the trust. We're going to click on Finish. And now we see Verde Petra has a trust relationship with Globomantics. All right, well, this is a good thing. All right, so everything is looking pretty good. We didn't have any hitches at all. Now, by the way, if you have a hitch in this process, which is not uncommon, okay, a couple things that I want you to check. First of all, you need to check to make sure your functional level is at least 2003 or above, preferably server 2008 functional level. Second, always make sure that your networks, that you can ping each other's boxes, all right? So we need to make sure that the Globomantics.com domain controllers can ping the VerdePetra.com domain controllers. If they can't, then there's obviously going to be a problem at the network level. And also, don't forget to set up your DNS records, or DNS, either a stub zone or a conditional forwarder on both sides of the trust. Don't just set up your DNS on one side, okay? If you do just on one side, it's not going to work. So you need to make sure you do both. All right, we're going to go ahead and we're going to tell this guy okay. And so now that our trust has been created, we can go ahead and we can close this down. We're done with the Active Directory domains and trusts now. So we're back here in the Server Manager. And now what we want to do is we want to see if we can actually have a user group over from Tokyo have access to the stuff that we have created over here in New York. So we're going to go into the New York OU. We're going to go into NY users. Let's go into sales. And now here we have the sales users group. Let's double click on the sales users group. And this is a global group, as you see. This may or may not become a problem to us in just a minute, so we're going to find out, okay? We're going to go to the Members tab. Here are the members of the Sales Users Group. Now, I happen to know, I probably should have shown you this earlier, but we do have a universal group over in Tokyo, a shadow group of all of the users that are in an OU called TK users. Tell you what, before we jump into that, let's go ahead and bounce back on over to Tokyo, and let me show you what that user group looks like, just so you see, you have an idea of what I'm about to do. All right, so here we are back over on the Verde Petra DC. I just wanted to show you real quickly the users that we actually do have and the groups. So we're going to go down here. You see that there is an organizational unit called TK users. So let's go into TK users. See, I have about 10 users in here, and I have TK sales and TK ops. Well, I'll tell you what, for our test, to make sure that our Tokyo users can reach the Globomantics stuff, which is really one of our primary objectives with this, at least at this point, because we need to have our Tokyo users understand what's happening over in the States. So let's take a look in the TK sales group here, because we want to give the TK sales group in Tokyo access to the sales docs over on New York Mem 1 here in the States. So we're going to look in the members, and you'll see we have 5 members. In the general, you see that this is a universal group already. So at the very least, the administrator was at least trying to think ahead, I think. But regardless, it's a universal group. So that means we can use this universal group in any domain that's trusted regardless of the forest that it's in. Because we have that trust available, we can use this group from the Verde Petra domain over in the Globomantics domain, okay? All right, so we're going to go ahead and tell this guy, okay. But I did want to show you what this looks like. I didn't want you to kind of be in the dark with the next set of operations that we're going to do, because over in Globomantics, what we're going to do is we're going to take TK Sales and we're going to make it a member of one of the groups that has access to the sales docs, okay? So let's bounce back over to the DC2 and let's go ahead and let's see if we can actually get to and see TK Sales from over here in Tokyo. All right, so here we are back over on the New York domain controller, DC2. And we're going to try to add in TK Sales, okay? So let's click on the Add button. And now, first of all, we need to decide what kind of object. Well, we want a group, right? We want a group to have access to the same stuff that sales users does. So now from this location, notice that we're currently in Globomantics. Well, that's not what we need. So let's click on Locations. And now let's see if we can find Verde Petra. I don't see Verde Petra in here, do you? That's because it's not there. Let's cancel these guys and let's go back over here to the General tab. Now I want you to notice that this is a global group, okay? Now if I make this a universal group and click Apply, let's see what happens when we get a universal group. Let's go to the members. Let's go to Add, Locations. Underneath Globomantics, do you see Verde Petra? I don't see Verde Petra. All right, let's tell it OK. Tell it OK. Cancel that out. Let's go back to General. Now let's try to make it a domain local group. Let's apply that. And now let's go back to the members. Let's go to Add. And now under Locations, oh hey, there we go, Verde Petra. All right, now by the way, in case that doesn't show up on yours, you may actually have to close out of the group altogether. I want to let you know this because you may not see it immediately. But you go to Sales, you go back into a domain local group. So here's the key, okay? If you want to take a universal group and give it access to stuff over in another domain, remember that AGUDLP strategy. Take accounts, put them into a global group. The global group becomes part of the universal group. The universal group becomes part of the what? Yes, the domain local group. Okay? So now when I go to Members, I go to Add, Locations, and I select Verde Petra. Okay? Tell it OK. Now, the name of the group, what was it? TK Sales, right? Let's go ahead and let's check the name. Oh, and there it is. It found it. Fantastic. We tell it OK. We tell it OK. And now you see that TK Sales from verdepetra.com is now a member of the sales users group. Now, we've already proven that the sales users group has a particular set of access to a set of folders over on NYMem1. So at this point in time, our job is pretty much finished, with the exception of the fact that we need to tell it OK. We need to wait for replication to happen. Remember the whole replication, let our domain controllers talk to each other, make sure that they know what's going on and who's been added to what group. But now we can give our users in Tokyo a shortcut using our whole group policy objects. Remember the preferences, we can create shortcuts. There's all kinds of stuff you can do. They should be able to now have access to that folder. All right, now rather than bore you with showing you how to give them how actually demonstrating them getting access to a folder, you've seen it already, you know how to do it. And besides that, we've already seen how the sales users already have access to the folder. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to call this a success. Let's go ahead and let's go back on over now to our slides. Let's talk about what it is we've accomplished, and let's do a wrap up before we move on to the certification stuff in this video series. All right, we got lots of words this time around, so hang on to your chair for this one. First of all, let's talk about Active Directory Federation Services. Now, this is actually a server role. I didn't demonstrate this for you, but you need to at least know what it is. It allows partner networks to share information across domains using single sign-on, meaning that a user does not have to sign on again to a website, which is, by the way, is what this is primarily used for. It's more often to share intranet websites behind a firewall and applications like SharePoint. And I probably should let you know that if you have partnerships with a lot of companies, okay, if you're looking at a situation where you have just, let's say you have 35 partnerships out there, well, then in that case, it's a good idea to invest in all the extra stuff they're going to require to do Active Directory Federation services correctly. Not to mention, it's also going to be a really good idea to invest in a SharePoint box too. Now, for our situation with Globomantics, as you saw, that was not the right situation, So it's all going to depend upon what you need, how many partnerships you have, and all that good stuff. All right, now trust is a relationship between forests or domains that basically allows sharing of resources in one way or another. A stub zone, as we saw, is a DNS zone that all it does is provide information about another domain's DNS servers. That's all it does. And it allows the other domain's DNS servers to do most of the work. Okay? A conditional forwarder. A conditional forwarder is basically an entry in a DNS server. Now, I know I didn't demonstrate this for you, but I did talk about it. So I want to kind of give you a quick definition of it before, and I'm going to talk to you more about this in the DNS video in the certification section. But basically, it just forwards on a DNS request if the requester meets a specific requirement, i.e. that the request for the information is for a resource in a completely different domain. Now, stub zones and conditional forwarders, as you pretty much figured out, they actually do very similar things. Okay, let's talk about an external trust real quick. An external trust allows separate domains and separate forests to trust each other's users without trusting every domain in a forest. Okay, so if you only have, let's say you have two forests, two companies, and you want the Chicago branch of your domain to trust the Chicago branch of the other company, then an external trust is a good idea. All right, let's talk about a forest trust real quick. A forest trust is a trust between two forest root domains, and it can allow users from any domain inside of either forest to share resources. A shortcut trust simply allows users to access resources in a different domain faster. Now, a shortcut trust, remember, you can only use this guy or create this guy in the same forest. In the Globomantics story, we would probably bring on Tokyo as a separate domain that would actually be part of another tree in our forest. Then we would create a shortcut trust between na.globomantics, which is in Chicago, and the new TK domain that we would eventually create. Okay. All right, a realm trust. A realm trust allows an Active Directory network that uses Kerberos to trust a Unix-based network that also uses Kerberos to share resources. Remember, when you see realm trust, you're going to automatically think Windows and Unix. Okay, that's what you're going to remember about that. A transitive trust is a trust property that allows for trusting of other domains if the domain that is being trusted trusts other domains. If the definition didn't make quite as much sense, go ahead and hit the rewind button or use the navigation over to the side and go back to the section where I explained transitive trusts. But you probably already know it already. So, the Active Directory migration tool, again, I didn't demonstrate this, but I did want to tell you about it. It's a free download from Microsoft that allows you to move Active Directory objects like user accounts and stuff between domains for consolidation. It's very, very handy and it's pretty easy to use. So that's going to be actually your homework. I want you to go to Microsoft.com after you're done watching this video. I want you to look up the Active Directory migration tool. You may or may not have any questions about it on the exam, just so you know, but at the very least, it's one of those things you probably just need to know about because companies get bought and sold all the time, and I want you to be prepared for that. So go ahead and, as soon as this video is over, go over to Microsoft, type that in, and look it up, get to know it a little bit. All right, so after viewing this video, here's what we should be able to do, okay? You should be able to define the requirements and describe the use of Active Directory Federation services. Again, I didn't demonstrate for you because in Globomantics it didn't make enough sense to do so. You should be able to define the types and the directions of trusts. You should be able to go through those different definitions that I gave you and describe them. You should be able to create stub zones in a DNS server in preparation for a trust. And then last but not least, at the very least, you should be able to implement a two-way transitive forest trust. And you should also be able to add a universal group from another domain to a domain local group and a home domain. Okay? So I want you to kind of be able to do these things. And again, when I do these what we covered checklists, if there's anything in here that you don't know how to do, go back to that section of the video, watch it again, Practice it if you have the ability. I don't put these up just for kicks, okay? This is not just part of the thing. This is really a checklist for what you need to be able to do after watching the video. Okay, so that wraps this one up, and actually this one wraps up our Globomantic story. Now, the next set of videos in this series are all going to have to do with certification topics, and they're going to be a little more theoretical, although again, we're always going to be showing you stuff as we go through the videos, but they're kind of more for certification purposes and just so you have a greater foundation of knowledge. So again, what I want you to do is after you turn off this video, go to Microsoft.com, look up the Active Directory migration tool stuff, and then go on to the next video where we start talking about certification.